Hello and welcome to ILTV Insider. I'm Maayan Hoffman, executive editor at ILTV News, and today I'm joined not only by colleagues but good friends, people I often sit with to debate, unpack, and make sense of what's happening in our country. Between them, they've covered Israel across major platforms, written sharp op-eds, and reported from some of the region's most complicated front lines. But beyond their professional insights, what makes this panel special is that they come as couples with different views and voices. Linde and Liam Forberg and Linda Gradstein and Cliff Churgin are here for a lively, honest, and diverse conversation about the week's biggest issues: hostage negotiations, the Trump-Netanyahu summit, the future of Gaza, and whether peace in the region is even possible. Let's dive in. Now, Linda, there was a love fest going on this week. There is a love fest between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. When the Prime Minister arrives, he announces, here's a letter, I have nominated you for the Nobel Peace Prize. And we've seen many, many glorious photos and videos coming out of the summit between Netanyahu and Trump. The idea is that Trump is saying that we believe that we are going to get this ceasefire deal, that we will have some maybe 5-stage process, but hostages will come home. We've heard the optimism before. Is there real reason? Is something different now?
I think there is optimism. First of all, anyone who's covered the Middle East as long as I have, I started when I was 5, so 3 decades, knows not to make predictions, and yet I'm going to go ahead and do that. I think this time is different for a few reasons. First of all, President Trump really wants the ceasefire, and he's made that very clear. Now, he might lose interest by tomorrow. His attention span is not always, but if he really wants the ceasefire, it's going to be very hard for both Israel and Hamas to say no. Secondly, there's a growing sense in Israel that the war has run its course, that the army has said whatever has been achieved militarily is what can be achieved. 2/3 to 3/4 of the public want a ceasefire deal. Hamas is really hurting. There's a question of whether Hamas is even in control of Gaza anymore. So given all of those situations, Steve Witkoff today went back to Qatar to try to arrange a deal. I think we'll see at least the first deal. Now, some in Israel say, why are we doing a temporary deal? Let's just go for the whole thing. That's a little bit more complicated. And the issues are still the same. Will Israel remain in Gaza during the ceasefire? Will Hamas have to turn over its weapons? Will Palestinians leave Gaza? That said, I think we will see a 60-day ceasefire.
So we don't know all the details of the ceasefire agreement. As I mentioned, some of the leaks are saying 5 phases, about 30 hostages being released over those 60 days, in exchange for, of course, us not, at least Israel not acting a ceasefire of some form, and, of course, the release of thousands of terrorist prisoners. Now, Steve, is this a good deal for Israel? I mean, as Linda mentioned, some people are saying just either get them all back or don't do it at all. What do you think?
I think it's a bad deal. But we have to do it anyway because it's the only way, I think, at the moment to get all 50 hostages alive and dead back home as soon as possible. I think what we should have done is done a deal for all of them at once. But since it's not happening, I think we have to push this through as soon as possible.
Liam, you agree with that sentiment?
Well, I think the question should not be whether this deal is good for Israel. This is simply the second stage of the same deal that we were supposed to go through with in January, right? And the small details are the small details which we flip-flop with over and over and over again. And meanwhile, 5 soldiers killed today in Gaza, and dozens more have been killed since the ground operation, and thousands of dead Gazans and all of that. The question shouldn't be if this deal is good for Israel. It should be, why haven't we signed this earlier?
So, that if we sign a ceasefire deal, tourism and other opportunities here in Israel will obviously start to come back beyond the more important issues, which are the hostages, the deaths that are going on in Gaza, and us being able to return to some sense of normality. But I want to turn to you, Cliff, about this because, you used to work in the tourism industry. You're a certified tour guide here in Israel. We see flights are starting to resume. What do you think, from your perspective, can the country actually bounce back economically and otherwise if this ceasefire gets signed?
Well, I'm sure economically the country is going to be fine. I don't have a lot of worries about that. In terms of tourism itself, the general thinking is it takes a year for tourism to start coming back. If you think about it, if you're coming to Israel, you wait till it's quiet, and then you start planning your tour for the next year. So it's going to take a year before real tourism starts coming back. That doesn't include birthright and things like that.
Linda, what do you think?
I actually think it's going to take longer than that. I think, if you go to America or anywhere around the world, people think that Israel, and recently it was an actual war zone. So I think that people who, since the war in Gaza started, there were these solidarity visits, but there's almost no tourism. And I think that if you're talking about general tourism, people are going to say there's so many other places in the world to go. Why would you go to a war zone?
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of truth. We're starting to also see that, over 21 months basically of war, even the people who live here are having a hard time staying in the country, processing through the drama and the trauma that we've been going through. Yet Trump is actually pitching this idea that we're going to expand and have a regional peace, that in fact Israel is going to become a hub of the region. He spoke about possible engagements, obviously with Iran, that he's talking about continuing negotiations with. Netanyahus said he's open to agreements with any Arab or Muslim country who's willing not to seek Israel's destruction. So I want to talk to you, Steve and Liam, about this. Do you think that peace with Syria, Lebanon, or even Saudi Arabia is possible without first resolving the Palestinian issue? Steve, why don't you start?
Well, let me start, and I'm going to guess that Liam will disagree with me. But yes, I think although common wisdom used to be that you have to start with the Palestinian issue and then move on, I think the Abraham Accords have shown us that that's not necessarily true, and that if we can expand them to include the countries you mentioned, then I think that is a good path to go, and leave the Palestinian issue, which is the most complicated, to last.
Liam?
Well, firstly, I think we have to understand the atmosphere in the U.S. Trump is the only U.S. president who, in his first 6 months, has both sidelined Israel and used it to showcase his achievements and his successes. Bibi's victory lap can easily be overthrown by Trump's whims. Now, I think Israel's security establishment also understands by itself that peace with other Arab nations and our neighbors may not be able to go through without the Palestinians. On October 7th, the documents that we've got from Hamas have stated that a major issue of theirs is the normalization efforts going through. We may not be able to ditch that, and I think we're understanding that ourselves.
So, let's talk a little bit about the situation in Gaza. Gaza relocation. Trump and Netanyahu have both implied that this idea is still on the table, as recently as these talks happening in the United States. And some of the Arab countries might even be open now to taking in the Palestinians from Gaza, they're saying. Critics, though, accuse, of course, Israel of calling, they're calling it ethnic cleansing, that Israel is trying to kick the Gazans out of the territory. Linda, is relocation a good idea? And yes or no? And is it even feasible?
It's a bad idea, and it's not feasible. Now, I'm not talking about temporary relocation for 6 months to Sinai while Gaza is rebuilt, or however long it's going to take. I mean, Gaza is completely destroyed. But Palestinians who live in Gaza, first of all, many of them were originally refugees, but they have a connection to Gaza. They don't really want to go anywhere else. I mean, maybe a few want to go someplace else.
Well, now, don't the polls say that close to 75% want to leave Gaza?
I'm not sure that that's really correct. And they want to leave. Who's going to pay for all this? You're talking about huge amounts of money, and quite honestly, I don't think the Arab countries actually want it. So I think, they might say we'll take a few as a sort of gesture of goodwill, but nobody. I think one of the issues over generations has been that nobody wants Gaza and nobody wants the Gazans.
Cliff?
So I will agree and disagree with Linda. I think that it's not really Israel's place to tell people from Gaza where they're supposed to live. I mean, if Arab countries are willing to take people from Gaza in, and people from Gaza want to leave, we shouldn't stop them. But I will agree with Linda that I don't think Arab countries are going to be really willing to do that. However, I would also add that in long term, they have to come up with a solution for Gaza, because it's just untenable economically to have millions of people living in this small strip of land.
Small strip of land with no housing. Now, remember that Israel has actually gone in and is part of this war for 21 months. We've actually demolished most of the infrastructure. They're saying over 60% of the infrastructure in Gaza has been flattened. Where are these people going to live? And 6 months is probably unrealistic for rebuilding Gaza.
Whatever
We're probably talking
right.
about 6 years. If Hamas was removed from power, then we would have to also replace the governance, because if people are going to stay in Gaza, they need to have a government. A recent BBC report actually quoted a Hamas official as saying that the group has actually lost control of 80% of the Gaza Strip. So, Steve, is it time to seriously discuss the day after? Who should take over the Gaza Strip?
Oh, absolutely. We should be discussing the day after all the time. I think, Trump's plan is an interesting one, but I'm not sure it's practical. I think that Israel has to decide what's good for us. And what's good for us at the moment is to maintain security control in the Gaza Strip. I think we control about 75%, 3/4 of the Strip at the moment. I think we need, for now, until a solution is found, to make sure that October 7th doesn't happen again, and we need to be in control, at least from a security point of view.
And if we do that, though, wouldn't that mean that that ceasefire agreement just might not be able to come into play, the same one that we're talking about signing, because we were talking about maintaining military control of Gaza?
I'll throw that one to you, Liam.
Well, I think in general, also Netanyahu's remarks have largely gone to moderation, focusing more on the security needs, but emphasizing a real need for potentially sovereignty, because currently the IDF and all the security establishment is saying military rule cannot be sustainable in Gaza. This is the security establishment's position, and Netanyahu realizes this. In his remarks with Trump, he had said we are open for peace and for self-governorship for whomever wants peace with us. It's just a question of finding out who that person is.
Finding out who will be there the day after.
I think Netanyahu's biggest mistake has been a refusal to talk about the day after and a refusal to let the Palestinian Authority be part of the day after. And I think it's been a huge mistake. And basically, your two options are Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So if you don't want Hamas, which I think none of us here want Hamas to be in charge of Gaza, so what you're left with is some sort of technocratic government with the Palestinian Authority, but that could have already been put in place months ago, and the war could have and should have ended months, if not a year.
Even though we all understand that the Palestinian Authority has its own set of issues, and hence you can't just helicopter them into Gaza and expect them to govern millions of people. Now, interestingly, to bring up the Palestinian Authority, the Wall Street Journal had a very interesting article at the beginning of the month, or the beginning of the week, where they said that a group of Hebron sheikhs actually want to form an independent emirate and make peace with Israel as part of joining the Abraham Accords. Minister Nir Barkat has actually been talking about this for a long time. I've had many discussions with him about this before we saw this article come out in the Wall Street Journal, and he has said this is something that he largely supports. The letter that the sheikhs put out was addressed to Netanyahu. Liam, is this a possibility, or is it really like talking about some fantasy over here?
Well, I think there is a lot of room to talk about alternative governorship solutions against Hamas and against a very corrupt PA. Reform ideas from the U.S. have risen regarding the PA. But to have an idea like this that's being peddled and is the darling of right-wing settlers, especially when it comes to the Jabari clan in Hebron, who have been featured prominently on organizations like Im Tirtzu and Mordechai Kedar's Emirates plan, is absolute nonsense. It reeks of unseriousness, hubris, and it is incredibly dangerous.
I, on the other hand, think that it is significant, and it's significant that people are speaking out and bringing up alternative plans. But I think whether it is a serious plan, and I believe it is, or not, this is the time to start shaking things up and raising alternatives, thinking out of the box.
Well, and certainly it is a statement against the Palestinian Authority. We generally don't see Palestinians speak out against the PA openly and publicly, certainly not in the Wall Street Journal. So even if the plan is a fantasy, potentially, it is true, I think, what you're saying, that you're starting to say, oh, people are wanting something different. Linda, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a time, I think that the Palestinians have to go to elections. In other words, they've had to go to Mahmoud Abbas, I think, is on the 19th year of a 4-year term. And if you talk to Palestinians in Ramallah and elsewhere, they are not big fans of Abbas. They want elections. They want a new Palestinian Authority. That said, this plan, I think, is kind of a fantasy, and it's like this sort of right-wing fantasy, like, look, there are some Arabs who like us. Well,
So I was actually going to bring it back to something you mentioned earlier, Maayan, and that is, I think it's an amazing opportunity and extreme danger for Israel, is the billions of dollars that are going to be flowing into the Gaza Strip to rebuild it. Who's going to control that money? And the greatest danger for Israel is that Hamas is going to get hold of that money. They're going to be in charge of rebuilding, and they're going to rebuild their power. So Israel has to find a way to keep Hamas away from that money.
Look, I think there really should be an alternate ability to govern themselves, but a tribal Hamula-like rule has proven around the Middle East to be only creator of vast chaos, sectarianism. You look at Syria, you look at Iraq, that formation does not work for modern democratic societies, which is what we need the Palestinians to be if we're going to have bilateral talks with them.
Didn't we also try it in the 1980s?
We have. We tried it in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in the form of the Villages League. It was an initiative that was first brought up to the Sharon government, if I'm not mistaken. And it was, the difference between this and the Villages League is that that was a real grassroots effort. And before 40 more years of military rule and Oslo and everything, and all of that is simply not sustainable anymore. That, we should have capitalized on that 40 years ago. Now, we just have grifters who are co-opting the effort, and it certainly has no relevancy to Palestinian society today, if you ask me.
So Trump, is claiming, since we closed the war 2 weeks ago with Iran, that Israel and America smashed the nuclear program in Iran. So I want to take us over there now for a moment. But there are a lot of experts that are saying that it was very effective, but it really just delayed the nuclear program, that we might have to do this again. Steve, are we going to go back into active conflict with Iran, or has that passed?
I certainly hope it's passed for now. I think we set back the Iranian nuclear and missile program years, hopefully, more than a decade. And I think our job now is to make sure that they never get back on track again. And I have no doubt that they will try. I'm not, completely naive, but we have to make sure now that the Iranians somehow never get close to a nuclear bomb again.
How do we do that?
That's a good question. Maybe someone else wants to try.
No, I mean, it's very difficult to do. And I think, if you remember, we talked about how, there's this bromance going on now between Trump and Netanyahu. The last time Netanyahu was in the Oval Office, just a few months ago, that Trump said, oh, we're going to have direct negotiations with Hamas. And, and Netanyahu kind of said, what? And so things can switch very easily. Trump very much wants a signed agreement with Iran. If that's an agreement that Israel's not comfortable with, I think you could see us going on. And to me, it's not, I disagree with you, Steve, that it brought it back a years or a decade. Everything that I've read talks about months, maybe years. So I think the DIA analysis said months. I think nobody really knows just how much damage was done to the Iranian nuclear program, and I think it's still a very real danger.
I think that what a lot of people don't appreciate is the fact that Iran, in terms of Middle East, it's a superpower. I mean, it's 80 million people with tremendous oil reserves. So no matter what damage we do to them, it's going to be pretty limited. And if they want to develop a nuclear weapon, they're going to be able to develop a nuclear weapon. So really what we're waiting for is for this, extreme Muslim rule to end, to topple of its own weight. And that's kind of the race that's going on right now.
And that would be a race to support the people to bring that change. Liam.
Well, obviously, another hit on Iran will, of course, have to include the U.S. And if we're trying to understand the atmosphere in the Trump administration right now, I think we should be listening to one person who represents the America First wing of the MAGA movement, Steve Bannon, former chief strategist and now confidant. In a Financial Times interview, he had originally said he tried to convince Trump not to go on the Iran strikes, but when he did go through with it, he managed to reconcile between the hit while also keeping it America first by claiming Netanyahu tried to play Trump into his secret goal, which is regime change, whereas Trump, on the other hand, decided to go for a definitive strike and to go immediately for a ceasefire, sort of playing back Israel and showing who's boss. And if you're talking about another strike in Iran, I think you have to remember that the America First people will be a major, major focal point in this. They're afraid that Bibi is dragging Trump into the forever wars, and I think that's a really important point we have to consider.
And we're going to have to wrap up really soon. And I think it's important, as we've talked about, the challenges with the ceasefire. The hostages still in Gaza, 5 soldiers dead this morning. An ongoing war of 21 months, a fight with Iran, and all of our regional challenges, and at this Love Fest in the United States, so there is some, I guess, positivity. But I want to ask each of you, in a little bit less than a minute each, are you optimistic about Israel right now? Are you a proud Israeli after the last almost 2 years of war? Steve?
Well, I'll start because I think I'm probably the most optimistic here.
Well, then you should end.
Yes, I am. And I think if nothing else, what we've shown now, what Israel has shown now, is that we can do it if we want to. And we're not scared anymore. Not scared of Iran, not scared of terrorism, not scared of Syria or Lebanon or Hezbollah. And I think that my optimism is based on there's a whole new Middle East at the moment. And as Netanyahu says, the whole face of the Middle East has changed. And this could bring all kinds of good things to the region.
Amazing. Liam?
Well, firstly, I am indeed a proud Israeli. I do think that our current victory lap, as it is, this Trump and Bibi bromance, all of it can go away in 1 second. It will last until it doesn't. However, if we leverage this and use this leverage for diplomacy rather than gloating, for real coordinated efforts to bring about regional security for everyone, I do think we truly have a good chance here.
Linda?
I'm also quite optimistic, in fact. First of all, I think the Israeli society has shown amazing resilience. And the kind of things that went on of people helping people and, thousands of people going out to pick vegetables to help the farmers because there were no Thai workers, and people, buying coffee for soldiers. You see soldiers in a restaurant and you say, can I pay for their meal? And they say you're the fifth person who asked. I mean, I think there's been amazing things in Israeli society. Beyond that, I think things change. And I think that, Saudi Arabia wants peace with Israel. The fact is, despite this war, Egypt did not break off diplomatic relations. Jordan did not break off diplomatic relations. So I think there really is, I agree, there's a new Middle East and there's all kinds of opportunities.
Last answer, Cliff, about 30 seconds.
Most pessimistic. I'm very upset about the situation. I think we've alienated the youth of America to a very large degree. And I believe that we are in a very dangerous strategic long-term position.
Wow. Well, on that happy note, glad that we ended in that with you. That is unfortunately all the time that we have tonight. I'm Maayan Hoffman, executive editor at ILTV News, and this has been ILTV's Insider. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more conversations straight from Israel.